We're going to go ahead with our second session this morning on the new report, The Ties That Bind. And we're talking in this second session about faith, feminism, and family life. And I am pleased to welcome a distinguished panel to my right here. We have Hannah Rosen from NPR, obviously Belle Sawhill from Brookings here. We have Jason Carroll from the Wheatley Institution and BYU. And then I'm from the University of Virginia and the Institute for Family Studies. And I wanted to kind of begin our conversation by touching on one of the themes that was articulated in the first panel. And that was sort of on the trajectory of fertility that we're seeing both in the United States and in much of the developed world towards less fertility, towards lower fertility. In fact, just last week, the CDC announced that we're reaching a new record, or we've reached a new record, of about 1.72 babies per woman on average in our fertility rate here in the United States. And so I wanted to sort of have people just sort of reflect on the way in which both religion and feminism may be kind of affecting our fertility trends here, based both on this new report and other kinds of thoughts that they might have. And of course, one interesting, I think, sort of additional point just to highlight here is that a number of scholars and public intellectuals have been kind of talking about how feminism is the new natalism, how in some ways surprising we're kind of seeing comparatively high levels of fertility in countries like Sweden, for instance, and that may be because of the way in which they have more generous work-family policies and norms that encourage men to engage in their families. So I just want to begin our discussion by sort of reflecting on the way in which faith and feminism may be affecting fertility, and if indeed, if sort of having a closer replacement fertility is even an ideal for us. So maybe, Belle, do you want to jump in on this question at all with this first
Sure.
thing?
I guess that I felt like there was a hypothesis in this report that a more egalitarian gender ideology would actually improve fertility, and that feminism is pronatalist. And I think I don't agree with that. I think that feminism is going to reduce fertility for a very simple reason that once women have lots of choices, more of them are going to choose not to marry and choose either to have fewer children or possibly none at all. And when you add in the extra issues of cost and caring for children and so forth that Christine brought up, and all the other things that are driving fertility that Conrad brought up, I think that the whole idea that feminism is pronatalist is just simply wrong. Now, I think that religion is probably slowing down the long-term secular now used in the trend sense, decline in fertility in more advanced countries. And I think I want to make a more provocative point about that, which is when societies go through very disruptive changes, and we're seeing a lot of that now for economic reasons, for demographic reasons, and for other reasons, that's not good for society if the change is too rapid. And this big populist wave that we're seeing now may be in part related to that. So at the same time that there are certain forces that are requiring these adjustments and leading to lower fertility, maybe we do need some traditional institutions to both slow the process down a bit and also provide safe harbors for the people caught up in all of the disruptive change.
Hannah, any thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I'm so glad Belle said that. That's an interesting frame. I was thinking more broadly about religion, because you had asked, was I surprised by the finding that essentially, I mean, if we do take for a minute the idea that feminism is natalist, or that there are places like Sweden where sort of a more pro-feminist ideology has led people to have more children, I wasn't surprised that women in religious marriages were happier or were having more children. That part wasn't surprising to me. I think when I look at America, what is more surprising to me is that religion hasn't been able to stem the tide of non-marriage more than it has. Like, that seems to be the more forceful thing. Like, if you're talking to a woman who's already in a religious marriage, it's not surprising that she's happy because her entire world is kind of, you know, reinforcing the choices and decisions she's made. And if you've ever seen a video in a Mormon temple, or if you've ever listened to James Dobson, like the path of sort of getting religious men to be active, participating husbands has been going on for 40 years now. So I think that's sort of well accepted. But that more broadly, I mean, if you look at divorce rates and single mother rates, they are prevalent in places where people call themselves evangelicals, or where people define themselves as religious in some way. So that's what's, to me, more broadly surprising. Is how little effect religion has had in America on the broader trends.
So there's a kind of a story that the report kind of lays out in terms of like the difference between kind of being nominally religious and being sort of more seriously religious. And in that sense, we do see across a number of the outcomes in the report, like relationship quality, for instance, that the nominally religious folks, to kind of pick up on your point, Hannah, are more likely to be doing worse off in their relationships compared to those couples who are shared in their religious practice and their faith. And that speaks in some ways to the sort of the broader ecological point that you're touching on too, and that is that in some of our more religious states, like, you know, Arkansas, for instance, or Oklahoma, you see, you know, more divorce than you would in much of the U.S. But in states that are more consistently religious, like Utah, for instance, you see some of the more, you know, more family stability there. So there's a big distinction in the report at the individual level between those couples who are sort of shared in their faith and those couples who've got either a mixed background or who are more nominally religious.
Is there any other state but Utah? Because Utah's unusual, because the Mormon Church is so excellent at emphasizing both the role of the father and the role of family. I mean, the message is so consistent that it seems exceptional.
Well, we do see actually at the county level a sort of a more consistent relationship between being more conservative, and I'll take that here as maybe a proxy for religiosity, and more intact families. So that the states are, you know, often quite heterogeneous in some ways when it comes to sort of what's happening at the state level. But when you actually look at a more fine-grained level, we do see that more sort of conservative counties have both more marriage but also more family stability compared to less conservative counties. And then, of course, at the individual level, we're seeing in this report that couples who share a strong faith tend to be have higher quality relationships, and other work suggests that they also are more stable. So, for instance, there's new research showing that people who are regular religious practice or engaged in regular religious practice are about 40% less likely to get divorced. So, but the nominally religious folks are often doing the worst. That kind of speaks to your...
The what? The middle? The nominally
in the middle
religious.
sort of, category.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question? I was reading it and I was thinking, well, why frame the questions this way? Like, what are you trying to get us to think about? Are you trying to get us to think about ways in which kind of the left and, we call it the left and the right, but the religious and the secular have like overlapping interests, or sort of what is the, or is the idea, because I felt like I was trying to read between the lines in the message of this report, is that like, you know, we can't force people to be more religious. Like that feels like that's not a government policy that we can have, is everybody has to attend church every week. And so so if, you know, so what is the, what's the sort of, what's the message we're thinking about when we learn that, you know, people at the U curve or whatever, people at the extremes have the most stable and the happiest?
Let me respond quickly, and then I'll let Jason respond too, to sort of give his take on this. I think, you know, part of the thinking here, on my part at least, is that I think we live obviously in a very pluralistic milieu today, and one that is in some ways increasingly pluralistic and of course increasingly polarized. And so I think part of the idea here is to sort of to honestly think about ways in which, despite the sort of polarization that exists in our country, in our society, you know, are there points of common ground? In this case, in family life. And I think one of the sort of interesting pieces here is that it looks like, despite the fact that sort of feminists and at least more conservative religious people often have serious differences, I think that one thing that they tend to share is an expectation, a code that sort of men are supposed to be engaged pretty seriously in the life of family. And I think that's sort of a piece of common ground that's not necessarily recognized and could be more appreciated. So that's, I think, one response that I would offer to you. The second response is to think, too, about, and we can do this maybe a little bit later on in the panel, is sort of, are there points of common ground on, say, family policy that we could identify that might be fruitful for, future work on when it comes to sort of strengthening families in the U.S. And I've got some ideas about that we can touch on later.
I think one of the things that's easy to do, and it always happens with a report when you're trying to condense and get key ideas, is that a lot of this starts to sound categorical when we actually might have, in many cases, differences by degree, or we might emphasize and talk about what might be called the secular progressive, and then we have this kind of traditional religious. We also had progressive religious, right? And we had a traditional secular as well. And so I think those differences of degree start to become interesting contrasts as well. One of the things I thought for myself that ties into some of this is we paid attention to Pew and others that have also been emphasizing the range and difference of degree that we see around desired work patterns, often for women and mothers during, particularly with children in the home. And so then this issue of choice and this issue of being able to enact and follow a pattern that someone may choose for family life, or particularly for raising of children, there definitely seems to be, and perhaps in the highly religious in many ways, a child up, so to speak, mindset of how that's being chosen and decided on around that. And so there may be, even in some cases, a sense that then the sense of choice, the sense of pattern that is available, or the options that may be there with being at home full-time for a season, or part-time employment, or full-time employment. We see a range across that. And I think without getting into those realities, it's very hard to know what people would be saying they are satisfied with, that they're striving for. So I think we might, and we can talk more about it, I think we might have different pathways to sense of partnership and to sense of commonality. And one may be through a bit more of a sameness or a equality, so to speak, pattern. The other, though, may very well be a partnership through complementarity and equity. And if there's a sense of desire and there's a sense of equal kind of commonality towards it, we see these paths moving people towards a sense of feeling valued, a sense of team and partnership that really does let these different pathways lead to common symbols of value and unity and partnership, even though they may seem to start at different places. And I think that's where the relationship quality and fertility elements of that start to get embedded in those nuances that are always very difficult to capture in kind of the quick cuts that a report ends up doing.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, you're probably right that, say, Sweden and kind of traditional religious people in America might come up with the same. Sweden says you're home for a year after you give birth to a child. So there are commonalities there. But then if you move one step further, I think that the sort of major difference, or has been traditionally in America, is the family question. When you emphasize the family question, what happens is that there's resistance to universal child care. There's this idea that it has to happen in a particular way. And I think it's actually, in Sweden, women stay home for a year has been damaging for women in the workplace. So it's this idea that it can't be done by the government. It kind of has to be done by extra government institutions. That's traditionally how conservative religion in America has viewed child care, and so then you get stuck,
You say you get stuck, you mean in what sense? How do you get stuck?
To me, the answer is obvious. Like, there's been economic shifts in which women are in the workplace. They've been happening for a long time, and no allowance for childcare. And so it's just obvious what's happening in America. Like, we just haven't, it's an economic problem. It's not a spiritual problem. It's not a cultural problem. It's an economic, structural problem. And it's not going to be, like, when you say that women want to stay home, well, men should be able to stay home for a year. Like, if we like, the trends are obvious to me. The trends are towards women working more. The trends are towards more equality. There are exceptions to those trends, but those are the trends. And those are the trends in many, many countries in the world. And so the answer is structural. And there's resistance to that in the U.S., and I don't know why.
Well, just building on that, because I really agree with the first part of it, we know, we have great research on this actually, that the United States is way behind other advanced countries in terms of making work and family values consistent. And, we are not only the only advanced country, but almost the only country in the world that doesn't provide paid leave when a baby is born. And if you are a woman in a managerial or professional position, your employer probably allows you to take it and even keeps your salary going. But if you're a low-wage woman, you don't, and you are just no place. I mean, it's rather shocking to me. And childcare is obviously another example of this, and flexible work hours and so forth, and not saying to a low-wage worker in the service or retail sector, oh, well, you showed up for work, but we don't have any work for you right now. I mean, it's even being told in advance about whether or not you are going to be expected to work that day. And forgetting about whether you might need to arrange childcare. So there are all those policy issues. And just again, to make this a little bit fun and provocative, I wonder to what extent the fact that America is more religiously oriented and religiously conservative than some of those European countries is making it harder for us to adopt these policies that would enable people to combine work with raising children. So I would suggest to the religious community, especially some parts of it in America, I noticed, by the way, that the largest religious group in your sample was Catholics. And, we are going to have now a huge debate about abortion and birth control, which makes it even more difficult for women to manage getting educated, making a living, and raising a family, because they're going to have more trouble, planning all of that. So if I said something positive about religion being an important institution in terms of these major disruptive changes we're having, but it politically might not be such a positive influence. And that's not to take away from its very positive effect, I think, that you identify in your report in terms of personal relationships.
I think on the issue of paid parental leave, I think there is, a good deal of openness on the part of many religious institutions towards moving forward on that particular issue. I think that's a point where we could find some common ground, perhaps. Other areas, not so much. Mm-hmm. But I guess I want to just also sort of ask you, Hannah. I mean, I think it's true that there's been a lot of change both in Europe and the United States. But if you actually look at a more granular level at women's sort of preferences when it comes to how they combine work and family, what you see not just in the U.S. but even in Europe, and obviously a place like the Netherlands, is there's a lot of interest on the part, particularly of women, in working part-time, or in some cases even being at home full-time when their kids are younger. Mm-hmm. So I think, it seems to me like the public conversation about kind of work and family in the U.S. is sort of often predicated on this idea that we should be moving towards kind of a model where women are working full-time on a pretty consistent basis across the life course. But when you actually sort of are surveying ordinary women in places like the Netherlands or the United States, you actually see a lot of heterogeneity in their attitudes about sort of the best arrangement. And I think we could do better to sort of acknowledge that, and also from a policy perspective, kind of create a space where if you want to be at home part-time, great. If you want to work full-time, great. Or if you want to be at home full-time, great. And the policy should not be putting, a premium on one way to address these work and family challenges.
For sure. First of all, the Netherlands is an exception. I mean, I love that study in the Netherlands. Two, I don't think anybody should be working full-time. I think my broad objection to these conversations is that I for the life of me, in my soul, do not understand why this is a question for women. Men have children and women have children. This is a conversation for families. This is not a thing where, what do women want to choose, or how do women want to work? It's like, how do we want to raise our families? How does a father want to raise our families? The fathers should not be working full-time when they have children, obsessively, and the mothers should not be working full-time. Children need to spend time with their families. Families need to be together. It is not the mother's responsibility to, in my mind, even one iota more than it's the father's responsibility. So I don't think of it as like, how can the father help? I think of it as like, the baby is half the father's and half the mother's, and this is a family, and everybody figure it out so the children are happy and everybody's happy. That is honestly how I think about these questions, So we're always asking women, like, what do you want to do? What's your work-life balance? When do you want to have maternity leave? It's like, she's not the only one who had the baby, so ask everyone in the family what they want to do.
Well, the New York Times did do that a number of years ago, and they found that, there was a desire on the part of, I think Pew has done this, something similar, that there's a desire on the part of both fathers and mothers to spend more time with their kids.
Yes.
But there is also kind of a difference, in how moms and dads think about this sort of, this work-family juggle. And so on average, moms were more likely to prefer, actually the part-time was their preferred model here in America, and dads were more likely to prefer the full-time option. So I think we have to recognize that, yes, kids belong to both mothers and fathers, and they both have responsibilities. And obviously one of the points in the report is to sort of stress how that plays out in both secular and religious contexts. But there are also some differences in terms of what ordinary people prefer that I think we should acknowledge.
Totally, and I bet if you asked my question, you'd get different answers from men and women, but ask it to everybody.
So, Brad, I want to ask the following question in that context, which is, do you believe these differences that you've sometimes cited between men and women in terms of their preferences?
Right.
How much are they biological and how much are they cultural? Because
Belle.
I'm sorry, but we have to confront.
That's a hard one.
We have to confront it. And I do believe you wrote a book or edited a book about this.
Right.
And we may not know the answer. I certainly don't pretend to know the answer right now. I would only point out that data that show right now or 10 years ago or whenever that women have preferences that are different than men, that's because they've been socialized differently.
I think what we're capturing here is what I meant by this idea of partnership through sameness or similarity and partnership through complementarity, right? And with the progressive ideology, right, there's a sense that needs to be confronted, that needs to be changed, right? Where I think we see from patterns, and I think many from religious tradition are bringing with it a different set of meaning, perhaps, or the way that they're viewing purposes and fundamental identity. And so I think that the ideals, right, well, the one data point that I've got to jump in here that we didn't cover in the first session was the shared decision-making, which the central storyline was, across all the groups, similarly high shared decision-making, right? So in the highly religious traditional couples, right, the women are reporting same levels of shared decision-making in important household decisions, right? So I think when there's a process equality, right, there is at least those who have that view of family life, that they're much more comfortable with a complementarity model that might say we're both equally engaged, we're both equally contributing, but it isn't necessarily in a sense of sameness, right? Now, of course, for others, that's not their relationship regime, right? And there's that pattern of saying, no, that my partnership pattern is a sameness, so to speak. But that notion seems to be prevalent. We see it in many of our higher fertility families. that complementarity model seems to work and to fit for them. So the question is there space for that? Is there continued space?
There should be. I think neither Hannah nor I are
I
arguing
agree.
against that, yeah.
Yeah, and the notion too, and that's where I think that notion about choice, if there's a sense of feeling that might be a more supported choice inside of a religious community or context, if that's the view. So, yeah, I think that's where those things do. But when it comes to policy issues, then it starts to feel like, well, wait a minute, if we're trying to move towards these kind of progressive sameness policies, does this hold us back from that, right? And others may feel, wait a minute, we're prioritizing policies that are about childcare outside of the home. Are we doing the same for that when that's families making sacrifices inside the home? I think becomes a major part of that.
Now, you're obviously posing a big question, both, Hannah and Belle, about sort of culture and biology when it comes to gender. And that's obviously a hot button issue, a hot button question. But I think, the science on this is still, I think, in some ways, embryonic. But we do actually have, I think, research that suggests that part of the story here is biological, and, a large part, of course, is cultural. But what's also interesting, too, is there's evidence that suggests there's considerable heterogeneity, or there are considerable differences within the sexes, right? So that there's some women who are more oriented towards sort of work and, a professional life, and some women who are oriented more towards the family and domesticity. The same is true for men, but, in different shares. And my view here is, as we kind of continue to do the research on this question, that we'll see that part of this difference, not just between women and men, but within women and within sort of among men, is related to not just sort of cultural patterns, socialization patterns, but also to biological differences as well. And so there's a study, for instance, looking at, differences, in utero, for kids, and how those are connected across the life course to differences in behaviors and orientations. So I think, to be kind of fair to the admittedly kind of beginning research in this area, we need to sort of recognize that there's probably a place for this, both when it comes to sort of acknowledging the role of culture and the role of biology, but again, to sort of also recognize it's not just about men versus women, it's about how some women are different than some women and some men from other men as well.
Going back to the hours of work issue, I wrote a piece a couple of years ago citing John Maynard Keynes, who back in 1930 wrote an essay addressed to his grandchildren and told them that by now we would all be working 15 hours a week. Why? Because productivity would have grown so much that we could afford to. Sure. So I actually checked the numbers to see if we had grown as much as he expected us to, and we had. And where he was totally wrong is how we used our affluence. Instead of using it to buy more time to spend with family or to do other things, he was very into Aristotelian notions of, cultivating the arts and so forth and the mind. But another use of time would be family time. And we completely missed the boat. And in fact, the standard work week in the United States, after having plummeted during the late 19th and early 20th century, has been stuck at where it is, 40 hours a week, since the 1930s. And so I wrote this piece and said, why don't we think about reducing the standard work week to 35 hours? That doesn't sound so radical. Oh my God. Anyway, end of story.
Well, the research I find for me, what's between the lines in all of this is, it's not exactly about family, because there are also Scandinavian countries where sort of traditional family is decreased, but people still live together and raise children together. It has to do with isolation and connection. To me, that's the most sort of shocking trend that's happening, and I think the most interesting research to me is connected to time and kind of how badly we are managing our time and our free time and conceiving of our time and using our time in a way which is, the trend is away from, and I'm not just talking about kids and their smartphones, like the way technology has increased work hours and not decreased work hours and sort of made us generally less human, and how the effect that has on family and people's sense of isolation and connection, whether they're married or not. Like,
So one other question that I wanted to touch on before me opening up to the group here is, we've obviously even touched on already some serious points of disagreement between more religiously conservative folks and more progressive feminist-leaning folks, but are there kind of points of common ground that we could identify when it comes to either sort of a cultural agenda or a policy agenda? And I think certainly, just touching on your point, Hannah, there's a concern that I've been having is just sort of figuring out ways to sort of limit the sort of power and character of the rise of sort of the screen culture in ways that may be affecting dating, marriage, and family life as perhaps like one point of common ground. But are there other points of common ground that we could think of that might be there for us to identify and to make use of? Or Jason, do you have a thought on that question?
I really liked Lori's comments from the first panel about the commonality of the dignity of the person and the respect and the value. I think these domains of family life and relationships become deeply, deeply symbolic, and we're looking for the symbols. The symbols aren't exactly the same in every relationship, but they become deeply symbolic of what means I'm valued, what means that I'm heard, what means that I have a complete stake, so to speak, in marriage and family life and relationships. And I think there's commonality in there. I think the voice of feminism and gender equality has been powerful in that call of making sure that voices are heard and that choices are there and that there's that dignity and importance of that. And I think in the right dose. I think there's an important part of this report that shows that religion's effects, there's a dosage effect. If it's the nominal, there's not much impact, right? If it's at the attendance level, I think there's a higher dosage. I think when you add that to home personal worship and home practices, you have even more of a dosage effect. And in those proper patterns, I think that message is very similar about the dignity of the person and the value and the respect that should be there. And so I think they come from, again, what I think can be pitted as false opposites. You know, there's probably some folks, and if you're in the room, go ahead, raise your hand, you know, when we get to question and answer. There's a lot of folks saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm in that progressive religious category, right? And these are blending and mixing. That shared decision-making variable I mentioned shows that there's a lot of people having this sense of equality and decision-making, even those in our traditional category. So I think they're informing one another and having a common message there that I would hope for a rising generation of millennials would also be really valuable in a sense of that's how you're going to have relationship quality. It has to start with that sense of peer and equality and teamwork, right? Not something that's going to ever happen from a hierarchy or a distinction in those ways.
I'm going to say something that may sound like it's at odds with what I said earlier, but I mean, I do think, first of all, I can't disagree in any way with, you know, there are lots of different ways to live your life, and there are lots of different types of marriages, and we should respect all of them. I don't think any of us is saying, you know, we need to move away from that. But I also think that on the progressive side of many of the arguments in this space, there is too much emphasis on individualism and too little acknowledgement that social norms and social institutions do provide scaffolding, as the verb you use in your report, which I think is a good verb, for people's lives. And that without such scaffolding, whatever that scaffolding may be, it can be religion for some people, it could be some other kind of institution for someone else, those institutions are important, and we have moved in a direction in this country and many other Western countries towards so celebrating individual differences that we have paid too little attention, especially for children, I would say. Like in the K through 12 years, you can't teach values. And so if you're growing up in a family or a neighborhood where there aren't strong institutions, whether they're religious or otherwise, where are you going to get your values and your sense of support from? I think you need more than reading and arithmetic to navigate today's world. So religion, I think, can play a role there.
I liked your point. I had never thought of it, and I thought it was really interesting. The connection, this idea that both from traditional, religious, and progressive, there has been a cultural permission to kind of let men to sort of include in the definition of manhood emotional connection to your family, not sort of just like role, like your role is the provider, but just like a more connected emotional pose towards the family. And I think that is, I'd never thought of that, but I think that is absolutely a commonality on both sides.
So why don't we open up the floor to questions from the audience, and we can kind of continue the conversation. Is there a mic here? Well,
hello back there? No? Okay.
She's like, I got it.
Good morning. I'm Margaret Cope. My question has to do with, I agree 100% with you saying that perhaps we need more.
Just put it closer.
Okay, there we go. Margaret Cope. I'm retired military, but also work on gender gap issues, national service, and national security reform. I appreciate your comments with regard to connectedness and community, the value of that extended family. But another aspect is following up on your religion, because the religions have a broad spectrum. When you say Catholic, it goes from progressive to completely conservative, and so does Judaism, Muslim, and so when you say religion, there's a spectrum there for all of those. Maybe further definition with regard to that would be good. Also, the age of the study, 15 to 49, during that period, women go through a biological clock issue. And how does that impact the study?
well, there's obviously there are a lot of differences between religious traditions and among religious traditions. We're trying to kind of keep that relatively simple in the report by focusing on religious couples who kind of are more culturally conservative versus those who are more culturally progressive. And we do see that, in the main, couples who share a faith tend to do better in a lot of the outcomes, but not all. And there are, depending upon the outcome, those who lean a little bit right are more likely to be, doing better. But there's not in some ways, it looks like sort of the power of religion is, or the role of religion is more central than their cultural attitudes. Now, in terms of the second question, there isn't really, we're just trying to sort of focus in this particular report on women who are, in their prime childbearing years, or child-rearing years as well, but we don't kind of do much with sort of, differences among that particular age group in this report.
Well,
Yeah.
but when you reach like 40, that's kind of the end. So, that age group is not so much in the childbearing.
Right, they're more in the child-rearing stage, yeah.
It's simple at the broad level of that. We did try to, we controlled in all the analyses for children in the home or out of the home, knowing that could be a little bit different. I love what you're saying. I think there's a whole, there's so much that gets left on the editing room floor, right? As we all know with pulling together a report. I love what you're capturing there. I think it gets back a little bit into that dosage notion I was talking about earlier. And I think we will be looking at some further analyses of not only the amount of religiosity, right? We have a sidebar in the report that looks specifically at home religious practice. I think that's another indicator of orthodoxy, or the degree to which people are trying to live faith-centered lives. But then to couple that together with what you're saying, that kind of ideological spectrum. And like I said, we've got this group, we see them right there. They're progressive, highly religious couples, all right? And so I think being able to get into some of that nuance, we start to see a distinction between attendance, between those with attendance, but also with home religious practice, and then together with kind of the branches. But I will say this, the patterns were remarkably similar across all 11 countries and across a wider range of faith groups. So we do, in the relationship quality chapter at least, show a little bit in one of our tables. We broke out the quality index by religious affiliation, and the patterns are remarkably common across faith groups. Not saying there couldn't be more that was there. The great comment from earlier about mixed faith couples and relationships, but we did see that. So it was across all the countries, it was across the faith groups by and large, and it was stronger for women than it was for men. So I think those deeper dives are definitely calling to get into some of what you're suggesting.
Val, I'd like to use one of the comments you made to challenge your skepticism that feminism can be the new natalism. I loved what you said about there's too much emphasis on individualism because the social norms and the institutions provide a scaffolding. And if we look at the macro level instead of at the micro level, we find that countries that are more gender progressive actually do have higher fertility than the ones with more traditional gender roles. And I think it might be that expanding of choice. Your assumption was that the expanding of choice would lead more women to opt out and to not do the marriage, childbearing, and home part of women's lives if they had the choice, that feminism would lead to less kids. And what I'm challenging it with is the idea that if either social institutions encouraged men's participation or even just made the burden on women as mothers less intense, or that religious institutions helped support the involvement of men in family life, that choice doesn't necessarily have to lead to opt-out. And I think that's what we're saying is we might see a higher fertility either because of more gender egalitarianism, or to say it differently, but perhaps more accurately, in more gender egalitarian societies, you can see both gender egalitarianism and religion having a more pronatalist effect. That with choice, you would expect both of those things to shine out in terms of fertility differences. And I actually do have some macro level work that shows that that middle group does worse at the macro level too, that nominally religious countries have lower fertility than either highly religious or highly secular.
This gets very complicated, and if I'm understanding your pushback, which I appreciate, I don't think I'm saying that a more gender egalitarian culture, which allows women more supports when they are doing both things, doesn't help. It definitely does. It's an interaction effect, if you will. I'm saying that at the first level, before you get to interactions, that long term, I don't expect women having more choices and more equality with men is going to lead to higher fertility. So it's a simpler point, and it's a very long-term point, and it's abstracting from, policy regimes and religious dictates that might be asking dads to do more or whatever. Those things are, to me, second-order drivers, not first-order drivers. Does that make sense?
Conrad?
the big question in the report is religion a force for good or ill in society? And you show in the first chapter that the share of people across World Value Surveys countries who attend services regularly is pretty stable. The people who are attending infrequently is actually declining a lot. More people never attend. Since you show on a lot of outcomes, things are better if you are a couple who both never attend than if you're sort of nominally attending. Is it your contention then that the rise of people who never attend is good for society, or better than having more people continue to be nominal attenders?
Good question.
Well, go ahead, or do you want?
Well,
Yeah, that's good.
I keep thinking about that editing room floor and all the stuff that's still laying on the ground. One of the things that I think would be interesting for further analysis is, again, for simplicity and to not have graphs that have got 20 groups compared to 20 groups. We've got the low religious and the mixed religious together in these graphs. And I think we need a little bit of caution around that. When we looked at them separated, right, the mixed religious groups are a bit lower, which isn't a surprise, right? We've got basic same page, I think, is what we came to, right? The same page notion, if they're not on the same page. So that's in there kind of mixed and pulling that down, right? So it'd be interesting to see a little bit. I think our less religious don't quite get pulled down as much as these other groups that are tied together. The other part becomes really around people's, again, back to these symbols and sense of meaning and sense of purpose around this. I think it's easy at broad levels and in a multi-country report to start to look at it quite demographically speaking. But I think another deeper dive of where we're headed in some future analysis is also our data on life meaning and our data on life satisfaction and these kind of patterns as well. The sneak peek is that I think some of that would contend a little bit. I think people having those meaning structures, I love these comments about community and connection around that. I think it's possible across the spectrum, but we still need to see how that is done when we've had some of these traditional social structures that have provided that.
I mean, what's like, to me, this report's startling, alarming, maybe really good, I don't know, is that it's like the polls, people are happy at the extremes. People seem to be doing better at the extremes, whatever the extreme are. What the extremes have in common, when you're asking what are the points of commonality, the points of commonality is that they're extremes. And so it's just, I don't know how to think about that. Like, I like to think that polarization is bad. I like to think that people kind of believing the things that they believe, just kind of unquestioningly, well, not necessarily unquestioningly, but without giving much space to sort of gray area. Vagueness is not where I want us to land, but this report is suggesting, and it sounds like your meeting report, that actually people are happier that way.
I didn't interpret it as extremes as much as, and I think Lori or somebody talked about this earlier, is that it's shared values. Mm-hmm. You can have shared values around being very committed religiously and practicing that intensively, your dosage point, or you can be very secular and egalitarian and have shared values around that. And it would seem to me, I'm not an expert on, marriage counseling and all that sort of thing, but that one of the sort of common sense views, which is probably right, is that it's a lot easier to maintain a marriage or any kind of relationship if you have shared values.
Shared vision.
And shared vision. And I do want to go back to Conrad's point about is fertility, is below replacement fertility a bad thing or a good thing? I have really worried about the whole conversation around that. And I don't think that it's as big a worry as some other people do if we have below replacement fertility. The positive aspects of it is that we've got 7 billion people in the world and increasing, and they all want to come to the advanced countries. And it seems to me, with appropriate safeguards, they should be welcomed. So I don't get this point about, we need to worry about declining fertility in advanced nations.
Thank you for saying that. I'm so confused by that. It seems obviously that replacement fertility is a disaster for the world right now and creates short-term issues, but long-term disasters. Like, I don't know, maybe that's not true.
Yeah,
Like,
no,
when I read all this, I thought, why do we want replacement
no.
fertility? Like, the world can't handle it right now.
Environmentally, there's a whole argument there. And then finally, and I see a lot of people want to get in and maybe take issue with this. I think that, we should worry less about the number of children we have and what we invest in each one. And with limited time and limited resources, and this is what the millennials are choosing, right? If you're going to have children, don't have too many and don't have them too soon, because if you really want to invest in them and you really care about them, you do want to invest in them. You want to invest your time and you want to invest your resources. So you can have, more successful children or children with brighter futures.
Well, I guess in terms of kind of why would we be concerned about low fertility, I think that there are a couple things one could say. One is that just looking at it kind of from women's perspective, what the work of Lyman Stone at Family Studies suggests is that there are a large minority of women in the U.S., for instance, who are not having as many kids as they would like to have. And that number actually now is larger than the number of women in the United States who are reporting they've had more kids than they would have liked to have had. So I think because fertility is falling now so comparatively low in the U.S., and because women are postponing having kids for a variety of reasons, we're in a situation that's, I think, newer than it was, say, back in 1965, for instance. And then that's one thing that I would say. The second thing is it's pretty clear that sort of economic dynamism is connected to sort of population growth. And we know that, for instance, entrepreneurs are more likely to come from sort of the younger adult band of the population. So there could, I think, be some important economic implications of this pattern, particularly if it keeps going farther and farther down. Like we have seen play out in a country like Japan, for instance. And then I think thirdly, there's just a question about whether or not, siblings, cousins, matter for us, matter for our kids. And, it kind of depends on the outcome you want to pick. So if you want to pick education, I think Bell's perspective wins the day. It's clearly the case that kids in smaller families tend to do better on the education front. But if you want to pick, socialization, or if you want to pick family stability, for instance, I think my perspective is more persuasive. So we know, for instance, that kids who come from large families are more likely to have stable marriages. I think maybe the difficulties of navigating toys and activities and parental attention makes them perhaps better suited for the challenges of being in a marriage longer term. So it depends on kind of things you highlight about in terms of how you think about
if we're looking at connection issues.
Yeah, connection issues too. So having
and
can
that'd
be helpful.
A kin network
Right.
of its own.
Yeah.
Bunch of hands.
All right, so start with Christine and then move back.
Hi, I'm Christina. I was on the previous panel. A quick point and then a question. I was reading some research regarding the effects of both genders having parental leave, and it seems that the results from Spain have come out recently. They instituted parental leave for fathers as well as mothers, and one of the most noticeable impacts was that once fathers had parental leave, they realized that they wanted fewer children. Presumably, having stayed at home with their wives and with their children, they realized that, taking care of children is tough. Perhaps I don't need 7 of them. While women's preferences actually stayed the same. So, they increased, apparently, maybe because they finally had help. So I think that touches on a number of different issues that you've just talked about. But one of my questions is about this traditional versus progressive relationships, whether religious or secular. I think this result was surprising to me and will be to other readers that often traditional patriarchal relationships tend to be stable and tend to have high relationship quality. And you mentioned on this panel the impact of, yes, a headship dialogue, but one that also involves fathers being present, involved in their children's lives. And I wonder if you would say that that's an understanding of patriarchy and headship that has emerged more recently, or if this has been the case throughout time and we're only sort of coming to realize it publicly now.
An initial thought, at least drawing from the report, it's a great, there's a lot of places it can go. That's where I think that shared decision-making piece. We really thought in many ways that that would be the distinguisher that would trend in the direction of the shared secular couples, right? So we wanted to pay attention to that. When we see that, right, so our highly religious traditionals, women, reporting the same level of shared decision-making. Now, the other thing that we didn't get to is people always ask, so if they didn't say, right, we're about in the 60, 70, level of predicted probability of it being, the decisions are made together. You say, well, then what's the alternative for the other 30%? The most dominant pattern is that people, both men and women, say, I make the decisions. Right? It's not a gendered pattern where it's traditionally pointing at the husband or father or man makes the decisions. Either we make them together or I make them. Both men and women report that, right, in some interesting ways.
But I just, because this keeps coming up, do we have any idea what shared decision-making means to people? Does it mean where we're going to live, or does it mean whether we're going to have chicken or steak for dinner?
The question is framed, and all survey questions, right,
Yeah.
can be looked at. Important family decisions. Major. Is it major? Major family decisions.
All right, major helps. Chicken and steak is
I
not
got it,
major.
right. Wheat bread or white bread, right? So I love the question, though, because, again, I think it gets back to getting some false dichotomies here, right? And that it's not happening by degree, right? It's just a type. That of what is this sense of equality? And is it even possible to have complementarity and at the same time have equality, right? Do you have to have a sameness basis so that you can have that? I think there is such thing for couples, right, that I would say is a bit of a process equality. And it is in that decision-making. It is in that sense that I chart the direction and we have that sense of partnership of how that occurs. That's my sense. I think it needs deeper investigation of what is happening in the modern complementarity of many of these highly religious couples' relationships. And these women are satisfied. They're reporting this high emotional connection. We haven't even talked about the sexual satisfaction one, that they just trend away from the rest of the groups. I'm interested by that because I think these are individuals that are deeply impacted by this sense of equality, this sense of value, this sense of symbolism around that. And they're saying, I'm finding that in this type of relationship. If the assumption is that it has to be a shared or similar background for that to occur, that, like you said, it becomes nonsensical. How can that possibly be? I don't think it's a situation of being satisfied with hierarchy. I think it is a pattern of there being a complementarity, but still a sense of deep partnership and how that's being expressed in the relationship.
It might be defined roles. Like there are studies on gay couples which show the exact same result, which is that gay couples which divide so that in this study I'm thinking of, it was gay male couples where one person in the couple does the child rearing and taking care of the home, the other person is working out. Like the roles are pretty clearly defined, so they're not negotiating everything, are more happy and satisfied. So it might be that that's just a more frictionless way to operate, whether you're whatever kind of marriage you have.
They're valued, right? They need to feel that it's valued by their partner, feel that it's something that's important to both of them.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen that research on same-sex couples as well, and I found it fascinating because it shows exactly what Hannah just said, and it does support your point. The problem becomes when the division is gendered. Now, I'll just tell you that in my own marriage, I did not like to cook. My husband knew that I didn't like to cook. But I did the cooking because I'm a woman of my generation, and because he knew I didn't like to cook, I can't tell you what positive reinforcement I got from him. I could put the worst meal you ever ate in your life on the table, and he would tell me it was fantastic. And it's because he understood, because he was very smart, that if I was going to keep cooking, he was going to have to give me more than the normal amount of reinforcement to get me to do it. And I tell that jokingly, but I think, more seriously, there has been a pressure on women to do certain things.
I think that's your question, though, because I think one important, I can't really speak to sort of the historical, because I don't have data on that, but I think one interesting way in which I think contemporary religiously conservative couples and families and men have been affected by feminism is that there is, I think, a new expectation, for kind of the process inequity that you were just talking about, Jason, that is a kind of post-second wave, revolution thing. And so kind of in a weird way, I think that part of what's happening here is that more religious family men in America today are have been, and their wives have been affected by these set of new norms, and they're responding to them in part with, I think, a more engaged approach to the family because they do value the family and the marriage so much. So there's a way in which kind of feminism has had a pretty profound impact even on religious communities that we're now, I think, seeing manifested in sort of this approach on the part of religious men to being more practically engaged with their kids. So, and the woman just next to you.
Hi, Mary Budars. I'm retired. When you're talking about the difference between biological and socialization, what about economic? I mean, wouldn't that be another factor for decisions for men and women to make choices?
Sure. Yeah.
I think absolutely,
Yeah, sure.
and important to say too in this analysis we looked at in the relationship quality chapter in particular, it was just looking at kind of ideology and preference. It wasn't looking at actual, what was your current work pattern and what was happening. I think you're right. I think particularly when we look at this on an international scale as well. We were very sensitive to that, of the realities in some of the countries that we were looking at and those patterns. So I think you're absolutely right that issues of choice are always going to be based on this idea of the economic and physical survival of the family. I think that is a great caution for us. I think sometimes in academic elite circles, it's easy for us to talk as if that's kind of the commonality or the patterns, and then the reality is as we get into our Chilean or Colombian sample in this data set, we may be looking at very, very different contexts that are causing families to both inside and outside of faith communities to make real decisions around those fundamental physical survival aspects of a family.
I'm not sure what you meant by economic, but I'm going to put my own spin on it. There are very good economists like Claudia Golden and Fran Blau and so forth who've done these studies of why women have traditionally made less money than men. And after they go through everything and do this very rigorously, they find that the thing that stands out the most that can possibly explain the wage gap, other than some kind of discrimination, is the fact that women do spend more time in the home and have somewhat more discontinuous careers, less true than in the past, but still true. So this becomes then a circular thing. That women can't earn as much as men. That puts the preference on the male to do the breadwinning because he has the comparative advantage to do it. But as long as women are taking major responsibility for home and family, that's going to limit their economic prospects. So there's no way to get around that except to somehow or other just disrupt the system. One really interesting piece of research, again done by some really well-known economists, is that increasingly in married couples, we are seeing cases where the woman now earns more than the man. It's grown quite a lot. In fact, you all may not know, but over 40% of families in America, the woman is the primary breadwinner, either because she's a single mom or because she's in one of these couples where she earns more than her husband. But in these couples where the woman earns more than her husband, they also do more housework. And the researchers who discovered that empirically didn't quite know what was going on there. It didn't make a lot of sense, but they hypothesized, and I think they had some circumstantial evidence, as I remember, that the reason was because the women felt guilty about the fact that they were earning more than their husbands. I mean, they were worried that that was going to, undermine his sense of status, his sense of being an effective, successful breadwinner. And so they overcompensated by doing even more in the home. I can give you the citations to these studies if you're interested.
Although, just to be clear, in terms of married families with kids, it's 25% approximately of women who are earning more than their husbands. So the breadwinner story is partly driven by the fact that there
It's
are a lot
mostly
of
single
single
parents.
mothers.
It's mostly single parents,
Yeah.
but they're
Right.
here.
No, that's certainly right. Yeah, in the back.
I have a question. My name is Val Brody. I work here at Brookings. And so my question is about a concern that I have that when we talk about evangelicals historically in the polling that I've seen in recent years, and when we seem to be talking about traditional conservative Christians, we're talking mostly about white people. And I want to understand from your survey, did you do some racial breakdown of your groups of people you interviewed, and what did those things tell you that might have been different from what they said about others?
Do you want to jump in, Spencer, here, just quickly?
So in the United States, we did include race. There are some racial differences, but they're not as pronounced as you might sort of expect.
I wouldn't expect anything.
Yeah. Okay. They are there, but they're not overly large. In the other 10 countries, one thing that's interesting about race internationally is that I think many of us have this idea that most countries are as diverse as the United States is, and that's simply not true. And so I don't even think we have race in any of those other countries except for the United States, where we did control for it. And we did see some, but not huge differences. In terms of relationship quality, they tended to follow what the existing literature says, which is that Asian Americans tend to report the highest levels of relationship quality, followed by whites, Hispanics, and then African Americans. It's important to note, however, that those differences, like many of the differences that we've been talking about today, are shrinking over time. And I mean, if we extrapolate out, and again, that's a big assumption that these trends will persist exactly as is, but if they do, most of those racial differences, at least in terms of relationship quality, we can expect to disappear within the next 20 years. But again, that's a big assumption. I'm not saying that will happen, but yeah.
And then it's deeper dives for the interaction effects you're talking about, of putting that inside of faith traditions. And I don't think we
Although,
have that
in terms of
analysis.
my own work, looks at the impact of shared religious attendance on African Americans, Latinos, and whites in the U.S. This is a different project. It's my book called Soulmates with Nick Wolfinger. And in that particular book, what we find is that there's kind of a 10 percentage point premium for couples, Black, Hispanic, and white, who attend religious services together. They're higher than their peers who either don't attend or who don't attend together. And there are modest racial differences in that book between African Americans and Hispanics and whites, but the sort of the religious gap in relationship quality is larger than the racial gap. So if that's at all helpful to your question, too.
Can I ask a question of the authors? You had both cohabiting and married couples in your sample. Did you break them out? I would have assumed, based on much of your past work, Brad, that you would have wanted to look at them separately and had some hypotheses about levels of commitment and relationship quality. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, so in the interest of trying to keep the story fairly simple, we combined them and just controlled for marital status in this particular report. We've done some separate analyses that suggests that on average, there is more family life satisfaction and more commitment and more perceived stability on the part of married respondents compared to cohabiting respondents in the sample. But that wasn't, a key kind of sort of factor in this particular report. So.
These differences are quite small. Like, I guess I just want to underline a lot of these differences when we talk about contemporary trends in family. These aren't enormous differences that we're talking about. They tend to persist. They are important, but the difference in outcomes between cohabiting versus married couples are not enormous, because if they were as enormous as maybe some people think they are, we would have a much different place in the American family landscape. So yes, while these things persist, I do want to underline our data don't suggest that they're very large, and I haven't seen much data that would suggest otherwise.
Because of the stability piece, though.
Yeah, that's true. That is yes. In terms of stability, you do see relatively large differences, although even that one's still large, but it is shrinking over time.
In the back.
Gabriel Greenspan from the Competitive Enterprise Institute again. I wanted to get back to this question of paid family leave, and the thought that occurs to me is that there are two types of people that could have an objection to paid family leave for both parents. And the one type, that's kind of been alluded to in this panel is a, sort of fundamentalist religionist who says, well, the man's role is to work and, therefore there shouldn't be paid family leave for both people. But the other type is, kind of someone coming from, I would say, a very American tradition of suspicion of government, limited government, who's, kind of a libertarian who might say, yeah, it would be a great thing for both parents to be invested in the child, but, this shouldn't be something that the government is mandating on businesses. And, maybe this is something that should be done at the private sector, if businesses kind of voluntarily doing this, or NGOs or non-governmental institutions encouraging businesses to do this. And I guess, can there be a conversation about, for that type of people who might agree with the principle but not agree with the method of using government force, can there be a conversation about, maybe we can do this in a non-governmental way?
It's your
sorry,
that's your baby.
that is exactly where the debate is. There are still a lot of people, especially in the political arena, who would argue that this is not government's role, this is a family role. And if you're going to have children, you should plan for it and you should save for it, and then you're going to have private resources with which to help with some time off needed to take care of a child. And a lot of those people also point out that the private sector already does provide quite a lot of paid leave, although not all of it, and it does, as I said earlier, tend to be very tilted towards higher paid people. So yes, unlike other countries, the U.S. is still unable to come to any consensus about exactly that question. I mean, I might add as a footnote, that some conservatives would argue we need paid leave, but we should pay the stay-at-home mother for taking care of children just as readily as we do the woman who is in the workforce. And that gets into child credits and children's allowances.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Am I correct in thinking that your measure for religiosity, for lack of a better term, is the amount of times people attended church? Is that true? Yeah. If that's true, here comes my cynicism. A lot of people hide behind their religion. And a lot of these folks who attend church or whatever every week, and then you go to a party, and they're very proud about their religiosity. You go to a party and find, oh, he left his wife or she left her husband, And how do you account for that in a survey like this? And it's very common. I mean, I see it in my friends and my neighbors, and so.
Stay tuned. I know Spencer and I have a lot of interest in this. Like I said, we do have the one sidebar. We did think about that issue, and where I think you go with this is personal worship and home religious practice. Again, not that could, how much are you praying in the home? Do you have religious conversations? Do you read religious texts, right? Is this happening inside of the home, right? And again, it could be, those behaviors could be susceptible to the same thing, but I think less so than these kind of extrinsic religious social behaviors of, hey, I put myself in the pews. There's a social piece to that. It does, and we had a lot of conversation about should we build the religiosity index. We decided to go with the sidebar that looks at the patterns of prayer in the home, and it shows it to be a positive factor. I think it's a dosage issue, and I think it is trying to get to these subgroups. I think you'd get a smaller, so back to the question we've had, you may have bigger impact, but is it with a smaller segment of society, right? But you would find that that subset of couples where it is more than just the extrinsic religious attendance, but it is also the intrinsic personal worship. We also have some questions that get into people's sense of spirituality, their sense of presence of God in their lives, these types of things. So I think you're right. I think there can be even further. My sense is what we'd see is that group being even stronger in some of the effects that we've identified, but it would be a smaller segment of society that would get into that truly kind of personal orthodoxy pattern that hopefully would bring more consistency that you're talking about, not just kind of a here's my religiosity on a day of worship, but I'm different at other times.
But I think that another point I would make too is that number one, or I guess three, number one, religion is not a panacea, certainly in our view. And secondly, that there's certainly religious hypocrites, including myself, and different outcomes, as there are across any number of different ideological groupings, in American life. And then the third piece is there is kind of a classic difference in the literature between intrinsic religiosity and extrinsic religiosity. So people who are kind of doing religious things to sort of send off social signals often have things going on in the background that aren't so good, whereas folks who are trying to kind of, as best they can, be living in accord with their tradition, kind of at the sort of individual level, sort of away from the spotlight, tend to do better on a lot of these outcomes. But we're basically, at the end of our time, I just want to give each panelist a quick opportunity to say anything else that comes to mind. So I'll just start with Han on the left. And nope, you're good.
No,
Belle,
I'm very happy. This was really interesting. Thank you.
I just want to say that this was a very interesting discussion, and you all did some very interesting work. Yeah. So thank you for doing all of that.
Great. Jason.
Oh, just a thank you to the panelists and others who've come in. It's always great to get this kind of discussion and have this kind of feedback and dialogue. So thank you to all of you who've taken time to prepare and to be with us on the panels today.
Great. So thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.